We've put together an adult panel today, and I'm just going to introduce the members of our panel and then turn it over to Cheryl. On my far right is Rob Purser. Rob is a Suquamish tribal member and is also Directory of Fisheries for the Suquamish tribe. He's a member of our Kitsap Human Rights Council, and he lives here in Bremerton. Durell Green is next, and he works as a mentor and street outreach coordinator at Partnering for Youth, a gang intervention prevention program. He's dedicated to helping at-risk youth avoid incarceration. He's a community leader on the Police and Community Task Force in Bremerton. He's a national youth leader for Philip Randolph Institute and works with Black Prisoners Caucus, Civil Survival, and many other organizations. Next to Durell, we have Jafar Siddiqui. He is an activist and member of the American Muslims of Puget Sound. He has written newspaper and magazine commentaries and has been a guest commentator on radio and television. He also is a spokesperson for the United Muslims of Washington, an association comprising a variety of Muslim organizations. And finally, our esteemed, and then Jill. Dr. Jill Davidson is a school psychologist at North Kitsap High School. She has a PhD in school psychology and 35 years of experience as a school psychologist. She is a transgender woman who facilitates support groups for transgender people here in Kitsap and volunteers at the Q Center. And finally, our moderator, Cheryl Nunez, is the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion here at Olympic College. She previously worked at the University of Northern Kentucky and at Xavier University. And she served as a director of affirmative action and multicultural affairs at Northern Kentucky. And she may have an impressive resume, but we all know her as the woman who brought Angela Davis to Bremerton.
Thank you. Before we start, I would be remiss in not officially welcoming you to the campus. We are so proud to be associated with this and other such events. This is more important than ever. It's more important than ever that we partner to educate and organize around issues that are so critical to the nation. I want to start by reflecting on what Dustin Washington said and clarifying that bias, can you hear me? Okay. Clarifying that bias is, in essence, a preference. It's a social construct, a mental schema that operates as a preference for or against individuals or groups based on their social identity characteristics. When it is explicit, we call that bigotry, right? But it is when it's implicit that it's much more difficult to see, name, and address. Indeed, implicit bias is perpetuated by even people who hold egalitarian values, including the people in this room, because it inheres in the air that we breathe. It is internalized, as Dustin said, based on our socialization. So we're going to talk today about how implicit bias affects us at the interpersonal level and at the institutional or structural level, and then end by discussing strategies for addressing it. So I will start and ask the panelists to just chime in as you see fit. Let's begin by addressing how implicit bias operates at the interpersonal level from your viewpoint, and how it has personally affected you through those interpersonal relationships.
I guess I'll start since I have the microphone. I transitioned genders in 2010, and as a school psychologist, I'm involved in a lot of meetings. In 2010, I could be late to meetings, and people would stop the meeting and interrupt whoever was talking to have me speak. Since my transition, that doesn't happen. I have a little bit less forgiveness if I'm late. Sometimes people are egalitarian enough to treat me as a woman, and in this particular society, women have different rules they have to follow. I think I'll stop there. I think the other example I have is actually more institutional. I'll save that for later.
These days, being a Muslim in the West and being in the United States as a Muslim has more implicit and explicit bias than we have time to discuss. It takes its form in the word that you used, egalitarian manners, like it's not Muslims we're after, it's prevention of radicalization, of extremism, of terrorism. So much so that the word terrorism doesn't carry the same meaning as it used to. It implicitly means, or it implies, Muslim. And so whenever I hear the T word, I think, oh, here we go again. And I meet this kind of implicit bias where people also come and they say, well, you're different, but what we're trying to do is prevent crime, prevent extremist violence, and they sometimes preface it with radical Islam or terrorist Islamic terrorism. Somehow they think by tying another adjective to Islam makes it different. But the public, listening public and reading public, doesn't hear the adjective, they hear Islam. And very genuine, sincere people are made into biased individuals by use of such language and by such supposedly safety-oriented issues like fighting terrorism or protecting America. I love that one. We have to be sure that every single American is safe. Well, good luck with that.
I feel you, brother. Well, I'm a black man in America, if you guys couldn't tell already. I also happen to have cornrows. I also happen to not really be following the dress code all the way up here. I have on a Seahawks hoodie. And so I have learned in my personal life to embrace the implicit biases that come with some of the things that I cannot change. I have to wear my skin out every day. It doesn't go anywhere. And, you know, I choose to look this type of way because a lot of times I'll come to events like this. I might be the keynote speaker, and I'll show up there, and they'll be like, yeah, what are you doing here? Because I don't look like I'm supposed to be up here. And so I've learned to embrace that in my personal life. I don't get upset with it anymore because I feel it's my job as a citizen that cares about its community to help destroy those type of stereotypes and break down those barriers, so maybe the next time you see some black guy with cornrows and he has a hood on, you don't feel he's gonna mug you. You might feel like, you know, this is somebody that cares about upbuilding the community, and this is your brother, and you know, they love you. So on a personal level, it's like that. I embrace it. We wear it every day, and I think to an extent, not that you can ever be so bold as to speak for every black person. I think most of us are inherently raised to be consciously and subconsciously of what we look like and how we present ourselves when we go in public, so that we can try to diminish the effect that other people's implicit biases will have on us everywhere we go.
Hi, I'm Native American, and I went to a school that was mostly, actually anyone of color was a real small minority, and there's very few of us. But I experienced a lot of implicit bias from teachers, I've noticed, mainly not knowing at the time what it was, what implicit bias is, but I knew something was different. And implicit bias is the subconscious bias that we all carry. I carry it, I have it. I mean, it's the awareness that we do all have implicit bias. And teachers didn't expect much of me because of the color of my skin, and I knew that. I didn't know why, but that's just the way it was. And the thing now, I think, with education, with lawyers, judges, prosecutors, that all have implicit bias, becoming the understanding of what that is really important, and realize that they do carry it, and their decisions are impacted by their own personal bias.
So it's interesting, you've sort of taken us to the next question. When you raise the issue of language, for example, we're talking about bias now that's built in to our culture and that is expressed in our institutions and the media, schools, etc. So can you talk a little bit more about the institutional manifestations of implicit bias and how they are perpetuated even absent any, active complicity of individuals, but they are built in to the fabric of our media, our schools, our healthcare system, and how that has either impacted you personally or the impacts that you have witnessed on the groups with which you identify.
I think first thing I'd like to say is that each of us have multiple identities, and racism, for example, magnifies a lot of the issues that happen to trans people, and particularly trans women. So one of the examples I was thinking of, for reasons that trans people have oftentimes been excluded from any kind of work. It's only been recently we've had non-discrimination laws protecting access to jobs, for example. Many trans people have had to be involved in sex work. And I could have 3 condoms in my purse and go to Seattle and walk on the streets of Seattle, and I would not be stopped. If I had a black face, I would be stopped by police and frisked. And if they found more than 1 condom, I would be arrested on suspicion of prostitution. That rule of policing has been present in every police force. I think it's only been the city of Los Angeles that has removed that rule. And we have a 20% HIV rate among black trans women in this country. The rate is much lower among white trans women. I will not be stopped, partly because I'm white, partly because I'm an older woman. So there's some intersectionality with our identities that affect some of this. The other thing I would say institutionally is and we become aware of these things with our specific identities. It has astonished me how much of society sorts us into male and female. My Social Security account has a gender marker, which doesn't appear on my Social Security card. It appears in my computer account. My health records all have gender markers. My voting record has gender markers. My license has a gender marker. If any of those things don't match, we sometimes get into trouble. The Department of Homeland Security would put a hold on every application for employment for trans people if they didn't have a match between their identity documents showing what your gender was. Many states do not allow trans people to change the gender on their driver's license or their birth certificate, so they are excluded from work in many places. Homeland Security has reduced that somewhat. I could probably go on and on. I'd be using up my rest of the panel's time.
Institutional bias takes us into a different area where, again, under cover of patriotic terms and righteous terms like terrorism, like protecting the nation, like protecting public, or like identifying the murderous people, Muslims, and the evil people and the cult, again us, has taken a pervasive societal persona. It even shows itself in schools where teachers, I know this personally, where a teacher would have had a visiting parent who, and I won't go into details, but really identified Muslims in front of 3 Muslim kids who were about 6 or 7 years of age as not American. And the teacher stood there, didn't say a word. In my own daughter's school, the teacher was talking about, 9/11 anniversary, and I refer to that as the day when America pulls off its collective scab, because that's when the hate boils up. And the teacher said, be careful who you sit with, there are lots of sleeper cells around. And this carries on. In the law enforcement, police and FBI and the border security agencies, it's very common to attend conferences and training courses against terrorism, that big T word. And they talk about terrorism and they slip almost seamlessly into talking about Islam and Muslims. They do not talk about terrorists who are white. And always, if a Muslim does something, it's terrorism. If a white person, Judeo-Christian white person does it, he's what's the word? Either isolated incident or crazed person. So we see this everywhere, and almost on a daily, pretty much on a daily basis.
I appreciate you guys, because it's really impossible to touch on every area where implicit bias is institutionalized. Whether it's our education system, whether it's having a fair economic opportunity, there is implicit bias written into the black and white of all of these things structurally. Even if you just look at early education, when you have, I guess since I'm supposed to be representing black people, black kids in class, and they're young, and they have high energy, and the teachers don't really know how to respond with that, and so you are now categorized. You got ADD or ADHD, take some pills, go into special classes, and then you have the school to prison pipeline, and that's actually where it starts, is in that process already, and there's that bias. If you're talking about mass incarceration, the bias in the judicial system. The 13th Amendment that allegedly got rid of slavery actually says slavery will be abolished except for as punishment for a crime. And then when you see that, black people and people that are poor are disproportionately represented in the prison system, you're like, oh, so that's really why they wrote that into the Constitution. Bias. And this is the type of thing that, when you're black, you actually, it's almost like it's not even implicit anymore, because it's so embedded in your brain from a very early age that it's not gonna be fair. And you don't expect things to be fair. You don't expect people to judge you fairly. And that's the most dangerous part, I think, about it, how it's been institutionalized, is because as black people, we have those same implicit biases about ourselves that were imposed on us from other people. And that's starting to talk about the solution, so I'm gonna just cut it right there. But here you go.
Yeah, implicit bias, to rid of that, it starts at our childhoods. All the negative information we received, and we learn all the ugly stuff. We form, our brains pick that up, and later we get older, we're on a conscious level, we kind of evaluate what's correct and what isn't. But subconsciously, we still carry that implicit bias, and that comes out. And especially if on quick decisions, you need to make decisions, or if you're conscious of it, make decisions that are based on the facts rather than your biases. And most people don't realize they carry the bias. I don't believe, good intended people that are heartfelt, that always strive to do the right thing, and a quick decision can carry a bias too. That's what some of the studies are finding, and the institutionalized, Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, requires training for all 30,000 of their employees, judges, police officers, lawyers, because of this phenomena, and because it affects the decision making that these people have to make every day on people of color especially. So it's institutionally it's becoming, the great news is it's becoming an issue that's coming to light, and if everyone's aware that they do have that, instead of a knee-jerk reaction on a quick decision, take time to think about, is this my bias affecting my decision? I employ a lot of people sometimes, and if I'm doing an interview, I can look at my biases towards somebody if they're from a different color or whatever the difference is, and I can pass them up basically if I'm not aware that. Based on my subconscious, if I'm not aware of that, could happen, and therefore miss out on a good employee just because of some way I was programmed subconsciously. So that's that's very nice.
That's wonderful. I'm struck by the fact that we really could go on and on. For everything we've talked about, there are so many more examples. Implicit bias that is institutionalized was manifested after Hurricane Katrina in the use of language applied to those who were seeking to survive the storm and the flood. Some whom we called looters, who were black and brown, versus whites, whom the media called people who had found food, right? So the media, that's an institutionalized expression of bias. We see it in the child welfare system. At every juncture of that system, even perpetuated by people of color towards other people of color. It shows up in mandatory reporters who are much more likely to report families of usually black and Native and sometimes Latino children versus the families of white children. We see it show up in the disparities based on race, class, gender and gender identity and disability that are pervasive across every system and institution. They are so pervasive as to be predictable. And as Dustin Washington said, they've become normalized. So that even if all of us were to mend our ways and seek to be consciously unbiased, the systems would keep running along the same lines. They need to be reset. And so I'm going to ask the panelists to describe their solutions, their suggestions for how we address implicit bias, both at the personal level, but perhaps more importantly, at the institutional or structural level.
When I think of implicit bias and how it affects all of our different groups, I get overwhelmed with trying to understand the experiences of other people. And because there's only so many things I can be aware of, it feels like at one time, and each of us have different issues in terms of getting jobs, in terms of crime or being profiled, or access to bathrooms. Accessing a bathroom is not a big thing on my list. It's not something I fantasize about all day, and yet there's people who want to remove access to bathrooms for people like me. And they'll use terms like, oh, we're not talking about sexual predators, or no, we're not talking about transgender people, we're talking about sexual predators. Put us in that category. So we have different experiences that are similar across settings. And I think the answer to that is to tell lots of our stories, to tell stories, keep telling stories about our experiences. There is one of our few transgender women who has bestsellers out, Jennifer Finney Boylan, has said, her mom used to say, it's impossible to hate someone whose story you know. And I think that's the most important thing from my perspective, is that we tell our stories and keep telling them everywhere.
My approach on a personal level is to take things head on and not try to avoid them. I discuss who I am with people. I tell them I'm an American and I have the same right with them as does anyone fourth generation or sixth generation American. And I tell them I'm a Muslim, and whether my faith is in alignment with theirs is irrelevant. And if they've been fed some stuff about us that they think we are predisposed to violence or evil or whatever it is that they've heard or read, I ask them to read an objective book. Like, you wouldn't read about Jews in a book written by a Nazi. So why would you read a book on Muslims that's written by a Muslim hate monger? And so on a personal level, that's how I approach it. I know what I'm afraid of is creating a link where people say, oh, you're wonderful, you're good, you're all right, but I'm talking about, and then they start unloading all their fantasies and biases. So I always try to approach it on a more generic level rather than a personal identity level. And institutionally, and this is not a title I picked up myself, but I've been called, among a lot of other things, activist. That's one of the more benign terms. I deliberately go into meetings with heads of organizations and I challenge them on their institutional biases. And it's fascinating how suddenly they'll look and they'll say, no, that's not what we think, this is how we think. And I say, but how you think is what I'm telling you, it shows itself as. And quite often, I'm sorry to say, quite often they just say, oh well, and move right on. Once in a while, I strike a chord with somebody and they say, well, we need to change that. So it's just an incremental, tiny step at a time, and each of us is only responsible for that, as is each of you. Thank you.
Well, on a personal level, I think it's real easy. Just look in the mirror. Every individual, we could all sit here and be like, yeah, implicit bias is bad, and talk about how we've been discriminated against, but look at how we discriminate against other people personally, and then I believe that that's where the change starts. You could drive by 7-Eleven downtown and see people standing outside, every race, every age group, and you might look at them and be like, those crackheads, or they're messing up our community, I wish they would go somewhere. Well, maybe they're actually mentally ill, and the structure, the system is not set up to give these people the help that they need. So why did you just judge them when you were driving past? Did you think about helping them? Did you think about going down? It's legislative session right now in Olympia, and they're passing a whole bunch of laws that are going to affect our lives and maybe institutionally discriminate. So if you care, then you should be there testifying against or on behalf of some of these things that are going to take effect in our communities. And I think if we look at ourselves and really be honest and evaluate, I remember after 9/11, every time I went to the airport, I was looking for somebody with a turban on or something, like, man, they better not be tripping. And that's wrong. But I was taught by the media to think this way. It really plays on your subconscious mind. Like if I see some other black people and it's dark and they dress like me, I might be like, I'm not gonna cross the street because I ain't scared, but I'm gonna be watching them. And we really think these thoughts to ourselves, and even if you don't act on them, subconsciously, you had that gut reaction, and you got to check it, like, why did I think that way? And I think if we can do those things, even with me, I identify as a Christian. I go to church every Sunday. I almost live at my church. You know what I'm saying? That could create implicit biases right there, because you're transgender, like, oh, Christians don't like them. You're all going to hell. You're a Muslim, I don't like you. Like, these things are so deeply rooted on every level. And I believe that if we really want to change them on an institutional level, it does start personally first with challenging ourselves, and then be that change and be that example when you're with your group of friends. When you're with your white friends, talk about these things, that might be racist that you care about. Because if they hear me say it, implicit bias, like, oh, I don't care, black people always play the race card. Like, we've got to talk about this amongst our own social groups, and then, after this presidential run is up, maybe next time we can, never mind, I'm being biased, right?
Yeah, one way to combat implicit bias, of course, I think it's awareness and education. Understanding it, what it is. You Google it or whatever, you make yourself aware of what implicit bias is and how it could affect you, and how it does affect you actually on your subconscious level. Explicit bias, of course, is more the conscious level. We make decisions on what we want to believe, but implicit bias is what we're programmed. And as I say, that does make a difference on your decision making and your judgment if you're not aware of it. So the strongest tool I think we have is awareness, education of what implicit bias is and how it affects us all. It's used today in marketing, it's used in all over in different institutions. It affects people, and negatively so in a lot of ways. So especially teachers can really damage children and not even be aware of it. Police officers make decisions on their subconscious level that could mean life and death and they're not even aware of it. So it's important that I think we all get a better understanding of what implicit bias is and how it affects our decision-making process. Thank you.
I just want to add, if I may, that sometimes it's a non-starter to try to fix other people pointing out their implicit bias because it's something of which they're often unconscious. But the way we see it is to track its effects. And again, when we see disparities in our organizations, in our communities, the way to address implicit bias is to address its manifestations. Those disparities need to be eliminated. And so I think that is critical, that we begin to organize around holding these systems accountable, and we're sitting in one. And I will say that includes Olympic College. So I invite you all to begin thinking with us about how we can, here at the college, reduce those gaps that I described. I want to give you time for questions now, so any questions? Do we have a mic? There's a mic in the back.
My principal voice.
Okay, go ahead and I'll repeat it.
I'm a retired school principal, and my concern is that we don't teach a true and just history. We teach a history where I learned, and it was always a proverbial black man or whoever it was, you couldn't really tell gender. They're on their knees, thanking God. And I always like to say, and he still has the damn manacles on his arms, but they got there. It says chains are broken. Has anybody ever seen that one? It showed up in all the history books, I think, for a lot of people. And it's an insult. It's a real insult. And so, and if that's the only thing that I, as a black child, was going to learn in my high school years, was that they got freed and all was well with the world. Mm-hmm. It makes no sense to me. So I don't know if it's a question so much as anything. It says, when will we ever get to true and just history of all people? Because more than one group of people came here and have been a part of this world and have been real good people who have put into the world and have invested themselves here. And if I have to say anybody, the minority group probably have vested themselves more than the other group who has had to have an easier way.
So did everybody hear the question? Just to summarize, okay. So the question is, the issue is history, representation, and as it is taught in schools. Do you want to address the curriculum and how it perpetuates implicit bias and what ought to be done about it?
I have some strong opinions, but I'm going to keep it short because I think my panelists also have strong opinions. I think we need to get kids into history and writing their own histories and families telling stories, because historically, historians have been white men for the most part, and they don't have the full picture. We have all these micro-histories out there that has not gotten into the books, at least books outside maybe of our own families.
You're talking about schools. Well, I think you should all, when you go back to your areas, visit a school, go to the library and look at some books. You'll be amazed, if not shocked. I have seen books in schools that are virulently anti-Muslim and anti-Islam. When I ask the question, how did you get this book? They say, well, it's been donated to us. So there's an insidious way in which organizations can spread their hate through schools. I have also seen textbooks that tie Islam to violence. Islam has never been a peaceful religion. They have slaughtered, they have won by the sword, and so did this. And None of that is right. I know that. But once you put that in the mind of a kid, it's reality. So if there are any teachers here, I really urge you to check out your history books, to check out your social studies books, and go to the library and see what they have under Islam. And if it's something egregious, have it corrected. From they are hiding behind the label of balance. They say, oh, yes, but this provides a balance from the other side of the picture. Well, I tell them I've never seen a balance against black studies with KKK books. I've never seen a balance against Jews with Nazi books. Why are you so tied into balance at this point?
I got an answer to your question, but you ain't gonna like it. When will public education, like K through 12, have a balanced representation of history? Never. And that's probably really just the honest answer. It would take there's so many things wrong with our educational system, talking about K through 12. I'm not talking about independent education like you were talking, go to the library, or even what's offered at colleges. But K through 12, just history ain't set up that way. It's set up how it is, institutionalized implicit biases. It's hard to discriminate against people and keep them oppressed if they have high self-confidence. And you're going to have high self-confidence if you know your history and what you contributed to society. So unless there's some type of drastic, radical overhaul nationwide of our public school systems, first off, starting by paying teachers what they deserve to be paid, because they probably the most... you can't say, the children are our future and education is the most important, and then drastically just underpay the people that's educating them. We're saying that we care, but we're paying like we don't. And so there's just so many things wrong with it just structurally that, unfortunately, to answer your question, I don't have that much hope in the K through 12 to accurately depict history and paint the picture how it needs to be painted. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, to make it quick, I believe the history, U.S. history, how it's taught to our children, the U.S. does the history books, they do a great disservice to our children and to all of us, basically, in how history is taught and what's taught in history. The correct history creates a lot of implicable bias, how way it's taught. That's unfortunate, and looking for ways of changing that. I know my tribe has started their own school, mainly one of the reasons is so we can teach our students the correct history, a history that they're proud of, because if you taught the correct history, especially with Native Americans, the Native Americans are contributed a lot to this country, but that's never taught in school, and it would definitely change the biases if the true history was actually taught.
Can you speak louder?
Yeah, is that louder? Okay. I'm a student at Bremerton-Kitsap High School, and the panel spoke to the ways implicit bias is enforced, whether it be textbook choices or more obvious things like access to bathrooms. Do you have any ideas for student leaders in schools who may not be the educators themselves to try and make changes in schools to create more inclusive environments?
The question is, do we have any advice for students how to raise the pressure on schools in terms of changing textbooks or bathroom policy, curriculum.
Well, that was a great question. And to answer it, I believe it starts with people like you. Brave leaders that's willing to stand up, challenge authority in a proper fashion, and organize your other students that feel the same as you do. They had just actually started a Black Students Caucus or Black Students Union at the high school, and because they saw a need for it. And so you have to be a leader. It's probably going to be scary, you know, but you find some friends in the support group and other people that care about it, and you guys organize, and that's how it starts. And you can bring change about, and it doesn't matter if it's just you and one other person at the beginning. Somebody got to be brave and step out there and talk to your local community leaders, because there's people that are waiting for young folks like you. You know, they're waiting to hear you, and they will help you.
I'd just like to add, and you hear our panelists connecting the dots, talking about transgender rights and raising intersectional issues with race, talking about, you know, Black lives and Black Christian life, and raising issues of you know, religious bias. I think it's important that when you organize, you're organizing across these issues, because then you speak not just as individuals, you speak in thundertones.
Hi, my name is Victoria. I'm also a high schooler at Bremerton-Kitsap High School. I would like to know, how do you think this current political state reflects on younger people, such as high schoolers like myself, middle schoolers, or even younger people, and their implicit bias towards transgender people or colored communities, and what kind of ways should we take, or actions should we take to combat it?
I'll briefly say that I was I'm sorry, I should repeat it. The question is, okay. I was a high school student during the Nixon administration when Vietnam was the big issue, and at that time I was at risk, like other males, of going to war. And that was a very motivating thing for my generation. I think while I'm not happy with the particular political regime, I think it's a time that can motivate many students to really passionate activism.
I think we'll take one more, maybe two, if we can be quick about it. We'll take two more.
Okay, two more. First off, thank you for speaking today. Really appreciate your time. We are in the midst of a very polarizing political system and time in our country's history, and just going back to the messages that we're hearing, stuff like "Make America Great Again," "Keep America Safe," and "America First." Trying to leave the politics out of it the best we can. How do those messages resonate with any of you?
So the question is, the slogans that we're hearing in the particular political climate, "Make America Great Again," "America First," how does that resonate with us? And how to respond to it?
Yes, please. From a Muslim perspective, this is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on ever since 9/11. Actually, it was established, God knows how long ago, well before 9/11. But 9/11 gave everyone a free hunting card, and after that, it hasn't changed much. The rhetoric has changed, and we'll have to wait and see into the second week and the second year to see how much the action changes. But there will be change in action. There'll be institutionally driven persecution that will happen. And how do you tackle it is up to each individual. Not everyone is a firebrand, but you do have to address it. In Islam, we say, if you can't do something about it, you think something opposing it. If you can't say anything opposing an oppression, then you at least think it. And so that's across the board for everyone. Challenge people when you hear that. Somebody who says, make America great again, ask them what was wrong with America 2 weeks ago.
That would be my comment. America is already great. I think what's going on the last few weeks is just bringing out a lot of issues that bringing awareness to them. Sometimes it seems like we're taking some steps backwards because of the biases are coming out now, more so by maybe the current administration. But my hope is it's going to bring awareness to everybody that, hey, we need to stand up and stick up for everybody, not just a few.
So I'm Lizzie and
Speak up just a little bit, speak in closer. Yes.
So I'm Josie, and I was wondering, if you see bias and want to educate people, how to do that? Because I have a severely disabled sister, so I'm used to getting tons of rude stares and commentary and stuff, and it upsets me, and I want to try to have the person.
Can you put your mouth right next to the microphone and speak loudly?
So if you see bias, how would you try to educate someone on it?
So if we see bias, would we educate people on it? How would we educate people on it? I have become much less shy myself, and I will attempt to correct people if I hear something that's clearly biased, although it can be considered rude. I've decided that speaking out is better than somebody thinking I'm rude. And so I'm trying to keep myself educated about all of our different identities. Where, supposedly the previous party in power made mistakes by what they're calling identity politics, but that's always been what politics has been about. We're a nation of different people, and we only get along and make progress on things like good legislation if we're understanding each other.
It's really difficult. The answer to your question is not easy. People who have convictions of their own, whether right or wrong, are not going to jump out and say, hallelujah, I see the light. And I've learned that a long time ago. But if you I was going to say confront, but that's too confrontative. If you at least face them and say, do you realize that there is a big bias here that is showing up? Sometimes it'll make them think, and some people will actually think constructively. And some people will just go underground when they're around you. But victory comes in tiny steps. Don't worry if there's failure, don't give up, just keep at it.
I would say, when you encounter a situation like that, get rid of your bias that you think automatically assume this person is stupid or racist or homophobic, and understand that they might really just only be ignorant. And if they're only ignorant just means that they're not aware and they don't know. So now you have been presented with an educational opportunity, and you can go ahead and politely educate that individual.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. You get on Facebook, you'll find all kinds of that. So stick with the facts, and try to figure out when you're wasting your time and when can make a difference is probably your best bet, because sometimes you're wasting your breath. But just stick to the facts and be respectful. the best way to respond, I think, to that.
Thank you very much. We've gone over. This was really informative. I am so appreciative to have this kind of wisdom in our community, and I'm sure we'll have lots of rich conversation over lunch. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.